So if you hadn't noticed, the United States of America is in crisis right now, and what are most Christians doing? Well, they're sitting in a burning building, metaphorically speaking, sipping coffee and eating donuts without a care in the world. Every Sunday, it's the same routine. A neatly packaged sermon, a praise band recycling the same 4 worship tracks, and a congregation smiling like the world outside isn't busy dismantling everything that they believe in. And the people who actually know there's a war going on, they aren't in the pews. They're either mapping out strategy or shouting about it on the internet, which, for better or the worse, is exactly what I'm doing right now. The left figured out decades ago that if you capture the culture, you capture the country. Even to this day, too many Christians, especially evangelicals, still believe they can win everything back by being nice to people, by playing it sweet. The reality, however, is that things have become so abominable that there's really no way out outside God's swift hand of judgment. And that is happening right now. You can't nice your way out of the culture war. You certainly can't outsource it to the same institutions that want you erased. And the sooner the church wakes up to all that, the sooner we can stop pretending this is all a friendly debate with our enemies, and we can start fighting back like it matters. Now, of course, the question is, why are so many Christians today like this? Why are we such pushovers? The answer to that is because, well, we were taught to be this way over the last 2 generations or so. This is why various foreign actors have infiltrated our political systems and institutions. So let's talk about a branch of theology which governs a lot of modern Christian thought and action, or inaction as the case may be, and serves as one of the chief explanations as to why so many people today are obsessed with toucans. Dispensationalism. What is dispensationalism? Dispensationalism is a system of theology that is popular in many American evangelical circles. It divides all of history into separate dispensations, which are different eras where God deals with humanity in different ways. Most versions have 7 of these periods, and it all started with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and supposedly it all ends with a future 1,000-year kingdom where Christ rules on earth. The big distinctive is this: it keeps Israel and the church totally separate. The idea is that God has one plan for ethnic Israel, to be fulfilled literally, and a different plan for the church, right now during what they call the church age. And this system does shape how Christians read prophecy.
Dispensationalists argue that throughout history, God has had 2 peoples. There's Israel and there's the church. And he has 2 destinies for those 2 peoples. Israel's is an earthly one relating to the land and to the temple, and the church's is a spiritual one relating ultimately to heaven. And they see a series of dispensations, periods of history that follow one upon the other, in which God is testing Israel or the church. And inevitably those tests result in failure, and so the next dispensation. Covenant theologians argue that God has one people of God throughout redemptive history, called Israel under the Old Testament and called the church under the New. And this one people, God has one saving purpose for them. And that purpose is to redeem sinners from every tribe, tongue, nation, and race through the blood of Jesus Christ.
Dispensationalists usually insist on taking end times passages as literally as possible. That's why they often teach this future rapture, Christians suddenly taken into heaven before a 7-year global tribulation occurs. People made movies about this. One of them even starred Nicolas Cage. And yes, if you thought those movies were ridiculous and silly, yeah, I agree with you. Anyway, tribulation. Dispensationalists believe God's plan for Israel will kick right back in. It'll lead to Israel's national revival, Christ's second coming, and a literal kingdom on earth centered in Jerusalem. Yes, Jerusalem, as in the city in Israel. So are things starting to come into focus now? A lot of these beliefs started back in the 1800s with teachers like John Nelson Darby, and it caught on in the U.S. largely through the Schofield Reference Bible, and over time it has become the dominant end-times view for both conservative and liberal evangelicals. It hasn't just shaped theology, it's shaped politics too, especially the strong evangelical support for modern Israel and a constant expectation of an imminent apocalypse.
You suggested it was a strange thing that I said a minute ago, that when I came into the Senate, I resolved that I was going to be the leading defender of Israel. And what you didn't ask is why, so let me tell you why.
No, you said I was obsessed with Israel, and you had just told me that, like, your driving motive to get to the Senate was to defend Israel. I'm like, I don't think I'm the one who's obsessed with Israel.
Okay,
I don't even think about Israel.
Tucker, words matter.
Uh-huh.
And you know that. I said I resolved to be the leading defender of Israel, and you said your driving motive, the reason you're in the Senate.
You want to be the leading defender of Israel. I would think if I ran for Senate, I'd be like, there are people dying of drug ODs on the street.
My driving motive is to fight for Texas and America, and to fight for jobs, and to fight for the Constitution. And you played a very, very careful word game of eliding.
You're the one who said it, not me.
So you still haven't asked why, but I'm going to tell you why.
Okay.
And the reason is twofold. Number one, as a Christian, growing up in Sunday school, I was taught from the Bible, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And from my perspective, I want to be on the blessing side of things.
Of those who bless the government of Israel?
Those who bless Israel is what it says. It doesn't say the government of, it says the nation of Israel. So that's in the Bible. As a Christian, I believe that.
Where is that?
I can find it to you. I don't have the scripture off the tip of my... You pull out the phone and use the Google.
It's in Genesis. But so you're quoting a Bible phrase. You don't have context for it, and you don't know where in the Bible it is, but that's like your theology? I'm confused. What does that even mean?
Tucker.
I'm a Christian. I want to know what you're talking about.
Okay. Where does my support for Israel come from? Number one, because biblically we're commanded to support Israel. But number two...
Hold on.
I'm not holding on.
Hold on. You're a senator, and now you're throwing out theology, and I am a Christian, and I am allowed to weigh in on this. We are commanded as Christians to support the government of Israel?
We are commanded to support Israel. And we're
What does that mean, Israel?
We're told those who bless Israel will be blessed.
But what, hold on, define Israel. This is important. Are you kidding? This is a majority Christian country.
Define Israel? Do you not know what Israel is? That would be the country you've asked like 49 questions about.
So that's what Genesis, that's what God is talking about.
The nation of Israel, yes.
And so is that the current borders, the current leadership? He's talking about the political entity called Israel?
He's talking about the nation of Israel. Yeah, nations exist, and he's discussing a nation. A nation was the people of Israel.
Is the nation
They're the descendants
God's
of
referring
Abraham.
to in Genesis, is that the same as the country run by Benjamin Netanyahu right now?
Yes.
I'm talking about the political entity of modern Israel.
Yes, and that is
You believe
Israel.
that's what God was talking about
Yes.
in Genesis?
I do, but
that country's existed since when?
For thousands of years. Now, there was a time when it didn't exist, and then it was recreated just over 70 years ago.
I'm saying, I think most people understand that line in Genesis to refer to the Jewish people, God's chosen people.
That's not what it says.
Okay, Israel, but you don't even know where in the Bible it is. So I don't know if we can...
I don't remember the scriptural citation. But, okay, I keep...
It's like Genesis 16 or something like that. But yes, it's in the earlier part of the book. But the point is...
All right, Tucker, you keep interrupting me before I finish my sentence.
It's just important to know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're... So you're saying as a Christian, if I believe in Jesus, I have to support the modern state of Israel?
No, I'm not saying that.
So ultimately in all of this, what you need to realize is that Christians were taught to take a step back, to let the world take control, let secular and pagan morality reign supreme, and secure the promised land for the oncoming apocalypse. That's the long and short of it. Now, of course, I'm a Christian myself, but that doesn't make me any less a heretic to these Christian circles. I don't believe a word of any of this dispensationalist garbage. I'm post-millennial. I believe the gospel will actually succeed in history before Christ comes back. I believe the nations will be discipled, cultures will be transformed, and Christ's reign will be made visible here on earth through the steady advance of Christ's kingdom by the Holy Spirit. And yes, that means the unity of God's people is something that will be achieved throughout human history. We ought not wait for Armageddon. The fact is that Christ is already reigning right now. And the Great Commission will be accomplished here in our time. In fact, we are seeing it play out in real time, but only those with eyes to see it for what it is will really and truly understand that. Where dispensationalism chops history into separate divine rules, I see one unified plan of redemption from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Where dispensationalists are waiting for Christ to set up his kingdom in Jerusalem, I believe Christ is already ruling from heaven, and that his kingdom is growing now through the gospel. And where the dispensationalist view often leads to political and cultural retreat, hunkering down, waiting for the rapture, I believe Christians are called to build, to engage, and to win. And naturally, this also means toucans are not the same as the Jews of Jesus' time. Nevertheless, the popular Christian evangelical fixation on dispensationalist end-times prophecies has wrought profound theological and political consequences that has allowed toucans, among other foreign actors, to contribute to the downfall of our once great republic. Understanding why certain groups like modern Jews have managed to establish significant power and influence over many key institutions means we need to look beyond their ability to gain access. Instead, we must also consider the long and complex processes by which many Christians have gradually backed away from pursuing power themselves. This retreat, driven by theological, cultural, and historical factors, has indeed left a vacuum that many others have filled. So let's talk a bit more about evangelical Christians. And when I say evangelical, of course, I'm talking about contemporary American Protestant groups that emphasize personal conversion, born-again Christians. Now, I should also grant, though this is not widespread, that when discussions refer to white people in American political and cultural context, they are often implicitly referring to white evangelicals as a key subset. White evangelicals make up a significant portion of that demographic and have been especially influential in shaping recent political landscapes. And I suppose it's also worth noting that evangelicals also include blacks and Hispanics as well. And so as a disclaimer, I will avoid framing these issues primarily in terms of race, partially because the modern concept of race is secularly rooted in evolutionary theory rather than biblical anthropology. In addition, race has also been co-opted by Marxist-inspired frameworks like intersectionality, which often serve to divide people into competing identity groups rather than fostering any unity. So I would prefer to focus on theological and cultural factors rather than racial categories. But if you want to categorize people according to race, then in your mind just replace evangelical or Christian with white as I continue talking. And even if you're not a believer, that's irrelevant. In this context, white does not just mean Christian. It means anyone standing inside the civilizational shelter built by Christianity, whether you acknowledge the architect or not. You could be an atheist like Richard Dawkins, sneering at miracles while you enjoy the moral order and personal freedoms forged by 2 millennia of Christian thought. Or you could be a deist like my friend Carl, nodding to a vague higher power but living comfortably in the house that Christendom built. The point is, many people benefit from Christian inheritance, whether they admit it, deny it, or spit on the name of the one who left it for them. But anyway, evangelical Christians constitute roughly a quarter of the American population, with over 84 million adherents. Yet their presence in the corridors of real power, like Ivy League institutions, major media, and elite political discourse, is minimal, even on the political right, where evangelicals claim significant influence. Elite conversations remain dominated by secularists, by toucans, and by others. So the question is simple. How does the largest religious group in the United States get shut out so thoroughly? Well, to put it bluntly, Christians have been trained to lose. The truth is that the organized minority consistently beats the disorganized majority. For we know that Jewish communities have forged decades-long institutional networks. They've raised millions in political contributions, and they've placed loyalists across government, media, and finance. Christians, and specifically evangelicals, by contrast, have preached political pacifism. They've avoided seeking power as if it were sinful. If we go back as far as the 1970s, evangelical leaders promoted disengagement from power. Big government was labeled as inherently evil. Seeking political influence was framed as worldly ambition, completely incompatible with Christian humility. Evangelicals were taught that their Christian duty and office was to sit quietly and ensure power was never used. It was a self-imposed political pacifism, a fatal handicap in the ruthless arena of power. Now, earlier I specifically talked about dispensationalism, but let's refer to something far more general, and not even owing its roots directly to Christian theology. Let's call this boomer eschatology, a generalized set of beliefs rooted in Cold War fears about the end of the world, the belief in some imminent apocalypse, shadows of which also reign within our climate change alarmism. Now, what is assumed through dispensationalism is that Armageddon will play out primarily in Israel. Therefore, the United States has a divine role in setting the stage for those events. So you put yourselves in the shoes of your average boomer. You're given an eschatology, a prophetic vision of what the end times will look like. So if your entire belief system is centered around a telos where the apocalypse will happen as early as tomorrow, that Armageddon is going to play itself out primarily around Israel, what will that lead you to do? Naturally, this means you screw over your children and hedge all your bets on the promised land and God's chosen people. I'm not even kidding right now. This is, in a nutshell, why modern-day Christians are so obsessed with toucans. So over a long period of time, Christian teachings have discouraged long-term political engagement and cultural investment. The idea is, why polish brass on a sinking ship? Instead, so many evangelicals set themselves to short-term goals, like saving souls in the here and now. Essentially, Christians became fire insurance salesmen rather than enact any enduring influence in political or cultural realms. So you really want to know why boomers denied their children and grandchildren a future? Well, of course it's because they were led to believe that their world was going to end as early as tomorrow. So again, why polish brass on a sinking ship? And many Christians today still think today's toucans are the same as the Jews of Jesus' time, despite Paul's clear teaching that after Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. In fact, modern Judaism teaches that Jesus Christ was not the Son of God at all, nor did they accept his path to salvation. These are things that are so fundamental to Christian teaching, it baffles the mind to see self-described Christians in politics today in exuberant support of toucans and their modern state. But the reality is, toucans are no different from Muslims. Every pagan is in dire need of conversion to Christianity. No group, not even those who claim to be under the umbrella of Abraham, ought to be favored or accommodated, particularly not when their only value is supposedly rooted in their heritage. Like, I thought it was supposed to be obvious that God's people are baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit. This all goes to show that even the smartest, most prominent people in politics or other elite institutions who claim to be Christians have no idea what the Bible says. Not to mention, are they at all familiar with what the Babylonian Talmud says about Jesus? And I guess since I'm already pushing it by even talking about toucans here, I won't go into any more detail. Just know, it is an absolute ridiculous state of affairs to know that you have people who call themselves Christians, yet they offer unyielding support to people whose religious beliefs are in direct opposition to everything they ostensibly are supposed to believe in. Figures such as Charlie Kirk, like Ted Cruz, like Mike Pence, and Franklin Graham, Pat Robertson, James Dobson, Rick Warren. The list goes on. So many of these so-called Christians, conservatives, liberal, whatever it is, they're vocal advocates for toucans and their modern state. And I can only think that they're all motivated by dispensationalist ideas. They're selling their future down the road because they believe the apocalypse will happen as early as tomorrow. It's crazy to think just how influential dispensationalism has been. It's been a powerful motivator behind much of Christian evangelical support for Israel, at least mostly from boomers. Pew Research data, however, reveals an ongoing generational divide is occurring. Younger evangelicals are simply asking why. Why is Grandpa so eager for the world to end? Why did he rob me of my future off the back of his Social Security and timeshares? No, you silly zoomies, don't you know? You were meant to resign yourself over to the third world. The rapture will happen any day now, don't you know? Armageddon is right around the corner. So when you think about divorce rates, about abortion, about birth control, about prostitution, about addiction to drugs, alcohol, pornography, and about all the various forms of homosexuality, all of it makes sense within a purview of the oncoming apocalypse. What you're looking at here is a world where Christians decided to back away from their rightful authority and influence because they thought everything was going to burn down anyway. And what have Christian evangelicals been busy with all in the meantime as we wait for the world to burn? Well, the idea that we were supposed to live in the world but not be of the world took root in a way that manifested itself quite literally. Some Christians talk about this in terms of two kingdoms. To put it simply, two kingdoms doctrine is the idea that God runs the world in two different ways. One is through governments, law, and everyday civic life, the earthly side of things. The other is through the church, where the focus is on the gospel and spiritual growth. The problem therein is that many Christians took a hardline stance of keeping their faith entirely out of politics, not realizing that God is ruler over all, not just the church. What that means is that yes, there ought to be a separation between the church and the state, but that was never supposed to manifest as a separation between God and the state.
Show me anywhere in the New Testament where any of the apostles are asking the magistrate to impose Christianity.
Right.
All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go, disciple the nations, baptizing them, teaching them to obey. There's a word there, obey. Teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. You want another one?
You can't do it. It doesn't exist.
I just did it.
Anyway, what's been going on throughout my lifetime is Christians have chosen to become cultural separatists. We built parallel institutions like schools, media, bookstores, and even colleges that taught us about Christ. Evangelicals also largely encourage their children to pursue trades or contracting jobs over elite professions like law or politics. And not to shit on trades or contracting jobs, but these are careers that will never directly cultivate state networks or cultural capital, and therefore, national discourse will remain largely shaped by non-Christians. And again, this is why toucans and other foreign actors have gained a stepping stone into governance and cultural influence. Unlike non-Christian communities that work within elite power structures, Christians were taught to reject secular universities and elite institutions and assume these were all just worldly things. They were corrupt or hostile by merit of their proximity to power. Needless to say, this goes against Christian principles. Christians were not meant to depart from the world. We were meant to redeem it from within. Now, evangelicals today suffer from a critical lack of centralized leadership, a vacuum that has persisted for decades. The collapse of the moral majority in the late 1980s, driven by leadership scandals, shifting demographics, and public backlash to its overtly political posturing, left the movement without a clear institutional air. And you notice in the public, when people do talk about Christian leadership, they've often been led to think about pedophiles, right? Funny how that same ridicule isn't ever leveled at institutional leadership like school teachers or politicians. You would almost think there was a concerted effort to get you to think of religious leaders as having the unique tendency of using their role as a priest or a pastor or as an elder to take advantage of younger people. Yet when it's an Epstein list, or if it's a school teacher, especially a female teacher, taking advantage of minors, well, what happens? It all gets swept under a rug. People might mention it, but nobody really talks about it. It's why, in particular, I despise our modern attraction to stand-up comedians, because the majority of them, not all of them of course, but most of them go in for the easy jabs. If they want to be edgy and talk about child abuse, they always direct their venom at Christians, never at any secular institutions, or certainly not any religious groups that are non-Christian. Anyway, that's not even what I want to talk about here. Ever since I've been alive, since the 1990s, I've watched Christian cultural reach and cohesion dwindle. Throughout most of my life, the Christianity that I have known has been a power that has been fractured into loosely aligned issue-based groups, regional church networks and independent media personalities. But there's never been any unity. It's all just been a bunch of people advancing their own priorities without sharing a larger agenda. And it's partially why I scoff at those who think that Christians are just one monolithic collective and address this as such. But no, Christianity, at least in my lifetime, has never functioned that way. And one supposes if it did, well, we would probably be in power, and maybe you'd be disincentivized to talk that way. But how does a religious bloc that makes up a quarter of the U.S. adult population make up only 14% of the nation's elite decision makers? Why is it that most leaders in politics, in academia, media, and in business are non-Christian or self-identify as Christian but know nothing about the Bible? Why as a Christian would you even go into politics if the entire point of anything you do in a secular institution is to ensure your own penetration is as limp as possible? Not only that, but think of younger people who want to get into politics, but then they discover they can't because their parents didn't do anything to cultivate long-term leadership pipelines capable of sustaining Christian influence. In contrast, we can look at Jewish political and cultural organizations and wonder, how did they achieve sustained cohesion? How are they so powerful that for years simply asking the question was tantamount and arguably is still tantamount to blasphemy? For over a century, we have groups like the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, numerous think tanks and advocacy groups and philanthropic networks have all maintained continuous presence in political and cultural life. They have institutions which operate with clear, long-term strategic objectives and overlapping leadership circles. It's all allowed them to weather any political cycle and adapt to an ever-changing cultural current. And the answer is simple. The reason toucans and other foreign actors are in power is not because they were clever or because they had some genetic advantage unique to their heritage. No, it's because Christians fragmented and weakened themselves and took a large step back from society, allowing our once great republic to fracture and crumble as a result. And again, we did this because we were taught the world was going to end. And I cannot even begin to tell you how angry this all makes me. Why in the fucking hell would anyone want to submit to a religion whose God is supposedly so powerful, so omnipotent, yet is somehow not capable of working through his people in such a way to conquer sin and death in the here and now? Like, we have anti-natalist feminists who are constantly talking about how their objective in life is the eradication of all human life because they were told life is full of suffering and death and nobody would ever want to experience any of that. And what's shocking to me is that some of these feminists are Christian themselves, or they hail from Christian backgrounds. And ironically, those who are women are often echoing what men have been preaching for years. This idea that the world is just getting worse and worse, not better, and that Christ's work was just not enough. Christ just wasn't strong enough to battle against the evil that is rife within this world. So is it any wonder why more and more younger people are turning toward orthodoxy or traditional Catholicism? Well, naturally, it's because most mainline Christian culture appears weak and helpless against the current storm. The only tragedy, however, is that these younger people are going to be made to enter a world amidst a rapidly collapsing Christian rule. There is ongoing secular hostility, including growing institutional gatekeeping in media and academia, and internal schisms over doctrine, race, gender roles, and the balance between political activism and evangelism. Yes, other Christians have become the enemy of up-and-coming Christians. And what does this look like to the rest of the world? What counts as legitimate theological thought and public engagement? Unfortunately, it's celebrity pastors, it's social media influencers, it's reactive culture war rhetoric. And the problem with all of this is Christian performative antics on these digital spaces is just as toothless as any other performance. It's short-term, week-to-week outrage over whatever the establishment narrative is, all the while failing to promote any lasting influence within the establishment. So the question is, how long will the current state of affairs last? Because let's look at this realistically. You have a movement with more than significant numbers, but little coordinated influence, often caught between its demographic weight and its inability to project that weight into elite decision-making structures. And all too often that weight shifts inwardly, all leading to petty infighting among Christians who ought to be working together to, at the very least, stop the state from killing babies. Now, as an aside, I've been talking about stuff that I grew up with. I want to talk about George W. Bush. When Bush was president, I was in high school, and what I remember was he was promoted as being some kind of a Christian warrior president. I'm not even joking. He talked the talk, of course. He threw around enough Bible verses to make his Sunday school teachers proud, and yes, the media of the early 2000s was all too happy to crown him a Bible-believing commander-in-chief.
Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me.
But we've taken a step back now, and what we've seen now is this was far from any divine leadership. It was a disaster that helped accelerate the decline of evangelical influence in the corridors of real power. And of course, it also helped pave the way for toucan influence. But you see, Bush's presidency was celebrated by evangelicals way back then. Today, many conservatives will see it as the ultimate lesson in how empty Christian rhetoric can be hijacked to justify utterly un-Christian policies. But for the conservatives complaining about him, it's all posturing. The spirit of Bush is still alive and well in today's conservative movement, much less conservative Christians. You know, there was an infamous phone call made in 2003 from Bush to then French President Jacques Chirac. Bush basically dropped a theological bombshell on him, citing biblical prophecy, specifically Gog and Magog, to justify the invasion of Iraq. Reports from Foreign Policy, The Guardian, and others tell us Chirac was dumbfounded. He actually needed an Old Testament scholar to make sense of it. Now, as crazy as that sounds, polling data showed evangelicals were among the Iraq War's loudest supporters. Pew data from 2003 says 77% of evangelicals cheered on the invasion, compared to 62% of Roman Catholics and mainline Protestants. Christianity Today also confirmed this backing only dipped slightly afterward. What's also funny about all this is Bush's phone call was used as a means of discrediting evangelicals. You know, it was made to show how Christians were far less political players and more cultural oddballs, motivated by apocalyptic fever dreams. And it's just one of a number of moments that nailed the evangelical posture. Aggressively political, but culturally sidelined, driven by sectarian visions rather than practical governance. But looking back at the post-9/11 era, Bush was the untouchable symbol of American grit. Dissent was treason, and his approval ratings were off the charts. The kind reserved for a wartime president or for a dictator. The man was America's mythic shield against the forces of chaos. But we fast forward to today, and like I said, the very conservatives who lionized him now spit venom instead. Bush is now the globalist sellout who ballooned our government. He wasted money and lives on endless wars, and he birthed the surveillance state. George W. Bush is shorthand for everything wrong with the Republican establishment. Weak leadership, reckless intervention, and utter blindness to the populist base. But here's the real kicker. This whole mess was fueled by dispensationalist eschatology, a wild theology insisting the world must spiral into apocalyptic chaos before Jesus returns. And regardless of Bush's awareness of this, evangelicals steeped in that belief were the ones pushing the war agenda, doing the dispensationalists' dirty work. They were in bed with the toucans then as they are now. So when you hear about evangelicals as a political force, you need to remember this. Their influence helped drag America into a disastrous war, all the while alienating them from elite circles who now see them as dangerous and disconnected. Funnier still, we still have this strange fixation with Israel. Even years later, when the powers that be have utterly emasculated any Christian presence in the White House. And it's funny, nobody seems to have a good enough reason to support Israel outside sloganeering for our greatest ally.
Prophetically, we are on the verge of the Gog-Magog war that Ezekiel described in chapters 38 and 39. This attack by Iran, who launched more than 200 missiles yesterday, is a tribute to the weak and pathetic leadership of Joe Biden. I assure you, if Ronald Reagan was president, we wouldn't be in this mess. Iran attacked Israel one day after our president looked into the face of the camera and said, "Don't." Don't you know they just laid on the ground and trembled with fear? They were loading the launch pad right then. The Democrats are trying to advise Israel to de-escalate, which is music to the ears of Hamas and Iran. We don't need to de-escalate. Hamas started a war murdering Jewish people. Hamas needs to be wiped out, period. So you heard me say, love is not what you do. Love is not what you say, it's what you do. So what are we going to do about it? You know, the providential timing of God is an awesome thing. Early in the week, when I began to feel the way this was going, I told our Christians United for Israel organization, we're going to have a Washington, D.C. fly-in. This is an emergency fly-in. That means you fly in one day instantly and have a meeting with Congress. After the service today, I'm going to get on a plane and fly to Washington, D.C. 250 more leaders from across the nation are going to converge there also. We're going to go to face the House of Representatives face to face and tell them to stop shuffling papers and actually do something to help Israel. I think they're going to be quite shocked at what we have to say and how vigorously we're going to say it. But it should have been done a long time ago, but God structured this in just a way that the door is now open and we're going to go through it like a bulldozer, I assure you that. They may not like us, but they're not going to be misunderstanding what we say. Pray for us as we go. We want them to get up and perform because we sent them there to represent us, not the Michigan people, not the people coming across the border. We stand for Israel, and we want them to bless Israel.
Something else I want to mention here is affirmative action programs and diversity mandates. DEI policies have undeniably reshaped access to power in many sectors, often resulting in the sidelining of evangelicals in those spaces. These policies persist under the guise of institutional and cultural correction, but who are we kidding? We know why these programs exist. They are specifically designed to exclude groups that do not fit into preferred categories, namely Christians or people who have Christian morals. In a nutshell, this is gatekeeping specifically designed to keep Christians at bay. And here's the other thing about DEI. Even if on paper the HR department proudly announces they've done away with it, you know nothing has actually changed, right? DEI is not a spreadsheet you can delete. It's a mindset. It's a religion. Once it's embedded in people's heads, and it has been well ingrained in people's heads, they're just going to keep practicing it whether or not there's a policy binder to point to. You're naive to think otherwise. Yes, they will still discriminate against white people, against Christians. The moment a Christian openly says what they believe, the label machine will kick in. You're a cultist, you're an extremist, you're dangerous. Meanwhile, a toucan says the same thing about their faith, not the same lens. What if a Muslim talks about their beliefs? No, not the same lens. Every other religious group is automatically filed under tolerant, under diverse, and enriching to the community. But the Christian? Oh, of course, the Christian is the one you've been taught to distrust by default. You can't really look at that asymmetry and honestly claim that there's not a deeper purpose behind it. No, there's an implicit, let's be real, spiritual form of DEI at work here. It doesn't need a policy to function. It's in the air, it's in the operating system, and it's always running. And you know, the irony is striking. A society largely built and shaped by Christians has now developed systems that, in practice, marginalize their own demographic. And what's funny is you can see how the common centrist Lulbert fantasy has developed from there. The problem with libertarians is that they believe they can consciously choose a point of disengagement from the people making the rules while expecting that society is just going to change by itself. You know, I've often poked fun at this idea, but many times you'll see Lulberts decrying authoritarianism while demanding how things ought to be. Doesn't it naturally follow that the way things ought to be must necessarily be enforced in order to keep things that way? And wouldn't it logically follow that said enforcement would only be possible because it has been authorized? So if you're at the center and you believe whatever values define the center are to govern how the world ought to be, then of course that would make you a centrist authoritarian. And by merit of you wanting to conflate woke with authoritarian, you've just become a woke centrist. And there, do you see how stupid the woke right bullshit is now? So anyway, what's the way forward? In short, we Christians, white culture, we were wrongfully taught to fear our capacity to wield authority. And so what we must do now is to abandon this false humility that equates ambition with sin. Far too many of us walked away with the wrong lesson from The Lord of the Rings. Many people interpret this story as a wholesome rejection of power itself, but this misses the nuance Tolkien intended. Power is not inherently evil. Look at Aragorn at the very end. He becomes the rightful king who embraces his authority. Elrond and Galadriel have long since been guiding the elves. We have Gandalf, who's a Maiar. He's a powerful being entrusted with one of the 3 elven rings of power. Narya, the ring of fire. Likewise, we know Galadriel wields Nenya, the ring of water, and Elrond holds Vilya, the ring of air. They're all rings that symbolize stewardship, wisdom, and responsibility, not domination or corruption. You see, what this is authority wielded in grace. Tolkien's message was not to reject power outright, but to be deeply wary of one's own susceptibility to corruption when wielding it. So I would propose evangelicals adopt a similar perspective. Ambition and institutional engagement are not sinful. Rather, the sin would lie in the abuse or misuse of power. And so by refusing to pursue and responsibly steward power, Christians risk remaining marginalized. Christians must go outside private spheres of light. We need to redeem the state and dismantle its position of idolatry from society. So to conclude, evangelical failure in elite discourse is not accidental. It is the product of decades of theological disengagement, apocalyptic fatalism, separatist culture, and fractured leadership. We've preached humility, but we live in fear of power. We've built and thrived parallel worlds, but refused to build pipelines into actual influence. Furthermore, we have the gall to be shocked when those who truly hold power use it against us, even though we are the ones who gave them that power. So unless we acknowledge all these realities and respond with boldness, we will remain the largest faith group in America, yet one that repeatedly surrenders to groups whose agendas are designed to continually marginalize, weaken, and ultimately destroy us.